Chapter 5, Part H of Greener Than You Think. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greener Than You Think by Ward Moore. Chapter 5, Part H. In spite of the anarchic and unspeakable conditions on the continent, I could not refrain from making one last tour of inspection. The thought of flooded mines, pillaged factories, and gutted mills was more than I could bear. The stocks of oil in England were running short, but I commanded enough to fill my great transport plane. We flew low, over roads crawling with humanity as a sick animal crawls with vermin. Some cities were empty, obscenely bereft of population. Others choked with wanderers. The Ruhr was a valley filled with the dead, with men tearing each other's throats in a frenzy of hunger, with the unburied and the soon-to-be buried sleeping side by side through restless nights. Not a building was still whole. What had not been torn down in pointless rage had been razed by reasonless arson. Not one brick of the great open hearths had been left in place. Not one girder of the great sheds remained erect. The Saar was in little better case, and the mines of Alsace were useless for the next quarter century. The industrial district around Paris had been leveled to the ground by the mobs, and Belgium looked as it had after the worst devastation of war. I had expected to find a shambles, but my utmost anticipations were exceeded. I could bring myself to look upon no more, and my pilot informing me that our gas was low, I ordered him to return. We were in sight of the Channel, not far from Calais, when both starboard engines developed trouble simultaneously, and my pilot headed for a landing field below. "What are you about, you fool?" I shouted at him. "Gas line fouled. I think I can fix it in a few minutes, Mr. Wiener." "Not down among those savages. We wouldn't have a chance." "We wouldn't have a chance over the Channel, sir. I'd rather risk my neck among fellow humans than in the water." "Maybe you would, but I wouldn't. Straighten out the plane and go on." "Sorry, Mr. Wiener, I'm going to have to land here." And in spite of my protests, he did so. I was instantly proved right, for before we came to a stop we were surrounded by an assortment of filthy and emaciated men and women bearing scythes and pitchforks, shouting, yelling, and gesticulating, making, in fact, such an uproar that no comprehension was possible. However, there was no misunderstanding their brusque motions ordering us away from the plane, or the threatening noises which reinforced the command. No sooner had we reluctantly complied than they proceeded methodically to puncture the tires and smash the propellers. My horror at this marooning among the degenerates was not lessened by their ugly and ill-disposed looks, and I feared they would not be content with smashing the plane, but would take out their animus against those who had not sunk into their own bestial state by destroying us as well. Since I do not speak much French, I could only say to the man nearest me, a sinister fellow in a blue smock, with a brown stocking cap on his head, "C'est une disgrace. Car je demande le pourquoi." He looked at me for a baffled moment before calling, "Jean, Jean." Jean was even more ill-favored, having a scar across his mouth, which gave him an artificial hare-lip. However, he spoke English of a kind. "Your airship has been confiscated, citizen." "What the devil do you mean? That plane is my personal property." "There is no personal property in the Republic, one and indivisible," replied John. "Be thankful your life is spared, citizen Englishman, and go without further argumentations." I suppose it was reasonable to take this advice, but I could not resist informing him, "I am not an Englishman, but an American. We also had a republic, one and indivisible." He shook his head. "On your way, citizen. The Republic does not make distinctions between one bourgeois and another." I looked around for the pilot, but he had vanished. Alone, furious at the act of robbery, and not a little apprehensive, I began walking toward the coast. But I was not steeled against isolation among the barbarians of the continent, nor dressed for such an excursion. Between anxiety lest I run into a less pompous and more bloodthirsty group of representatives of the Republic One and Indivisible, when it had come into being, how far its authority extended or how long it lasted I never learned, and the burning and blistering of my feet in their thin-soled shoes, I doubt if I was more than a few miles from the airfield, and therefore many from the coast when darkness fell. I kept on, tired, anxious, hungry, in no better plight than thousands of other wretches who at the same moment were heading the same way, under identical conditions. The only advantage of traveling by night was the removal of my fear of the intentions of men, but nature made up for this by putting her own obstacles in my way. The hedgerows which had been allowed to grow wild, the unrepaired roadways, sunken and marked by deep holes and ruts, and 100 other pitfalls made my progress agonizingly slow. As the moon rose, I had a sudden feeling of being near water, and coming out from a thicket, I was confirmed in this by seeing the light break into ripples on an uneven surface. But tragically, it was not the channel I had come upon, merely a river, too wide to cross, which, though it undoubtedly led to my goal, would increase the length of my journey by many miles. I'm afraid I gave way to a quite unmanly weakness as I threw myself upon the hard ground and thought of my miserable fate. I may have lain there for 10 minutes or 20. The moon went behind a cloud, the air grew chilly. I was nerving myself to get up and resume my journey, though to what purpose I could not conceive, for I would be little better off on a Norman beach than inland, when a timid hand was put upon my shoulder and someone said questioningly, "Angleterre?" I sprang up. "England? Oh, yes, England. Can you help me get there?" The moon stayed covered, and I could not see his face in the dark. "England," he said. "Yes, I'll take you." I followed him to a little backwater where was beached a rowboat. Even by feel, in the blackness, it seemed to me a very small and frail craft to chance the voyage across the choppy sea, but I had no choice. I seated myself in the stern, while he took the oars, cast off, and rowed us down the river toward the estuary. I decided he must be one of that company of smugglers who were ferrying refugees into Britain despite the strictest watch. No doubt he thinks to make a pretty penny for tonight's work, I thought, but no Coast Guard would turn back Albert Weiner. I would pay him well for his help, but he could not blackmail me for fabulous ransom. Still the moon did not come out. My eyes, accustoming themselves to the dark, vaguely discerned the shape opposite me, and I saw he was a short man, but beyond this I could not distinguish his features. The river broadened, the air became salty, the wind rose, and soon the little boat was bobbing up and down in a manner to give discomfort to my stomach. The water, building terraces and battlements, reflected enough light to impress me with the diminutiveness of the boat, set in the vastness on which it floated. Behind us, the French coast was a looming mass, then a thick blob, finally a thin blur hardly perceptible to strained eyes. I was thoroughly seasick, retching and vomiting over the narrow freeboard. Steadily and rhythmically, the man rowed with tireless arms, apparently unaffected by the boat's leaping and dropping in response to the impulse of the waves, and in my intervals of relief from nausea, I reflected that he must have gained plenty of practice, that he was an old hand in making this trip. It was a peculiar way to gain wealth, I thought, caught in another spasm of sickness, enriching oneself on the misery of others. I vomited and dozed, dozed and vomited. The night was endless, the wind was bitter. What riches, I wondered, could compensate a man for such hardships? By the time the wanderers got to the channel, they could not very well have much left, and unless my smuggler were gifted with second sight, he could not know, judging by the way he had accosted me, whether he was carrying a man who could pay £10, 100 pounds?